I live in a city with a public transportation system. They've been extremely short-staffed, and more often than not, you have to call to make sure your bus is even coming. On weekdays, during business hours, the public transit operator will order a lift for you to get to work if your bus isn't showing up or if they're short a driver. Tuesday, I'm at the bus stop after checking multiple times if my bus is coming, only to find out that it wasn't. They ordered me a lift, and this nice older gentleman was my driver. We had casual conversation, and he started to ask personal questions. I'm a bartender, and I'm super friendly already, so I didn't think his questions were ill-intentioned. Told him I'm not married and that I'm pretty much a loner. I basically go to work and go home and spend my time with family. He then says, "I'd marry you in a heartbeat." Again, I'm just thinking that he's being funny or nice. I asked him to drop me off at the downtown grocery so I could pick up some things that I needed for work. When we stopped, he said he was joking, that he's married and has a son my age. Asked if I was interested in maybe meeting him. Since I have a terrible track record, I figured it wouldn't hurt meeting someone out of my circle and comfort zone, so I gave the man my number and we parted ways. The next morning, he texted me and asked if I needed a ride to work. I told him he didn't have to do that and that I was sure my bus was running. He said it would be his pleasure and that he'd pick me up at my house at 3 p.m. Then about an hour later, he asked if I wanted to have lunch with him before work. I told him I was busy and that I couldn't do that. He said, "Okay, see you at 3. He shows up right at 3 and lets me know that he's outside. While I'm finishing getting my things together, I open the door and he's starting to walk up my stairs to my house. I told him I was ready and we could head downtown. When I get in the back seat, he turns around and says that he has a confession. He told me from the time I took off my mask, his heart danced like a butterfly. He said that he hasn't been able to stop thinking about me since the day before and that he'd love to spend time with me and that he'd pay me for my time if I spent a day with him. That's when I started to feel super uncomfortable. The whole ride was making me cringe, but know that when you're in a situation like that with the predator, playing nice is sometimes safer than freaking out. He continued on the entire ride about how he loved me at first sight and wanted to make me his Lebanese queen. As we got closer to downtown, I started to feel relief. He dropped me off at my hotel and said, "See you tomorrow." That evening at work, I checked my phone after a bust happy hour and he's texted me a couple of times. He sent a picture of the hotel and said that he'd wait for me to get off to give me a ride home. I told him I already had a ride, but thank you anyways. Thursday morning, I'm out running errands with my mom and sister. He texts me and asks how early he can pick me up because he can't stop thinking about me. I asked him to please stop and that I was with family. He continues to text me all day and evening, begging to see me and telling me his heart is aching to see his Lebanese queen. I just kept saying to please stop. Now Friday morning is where stuff hit the fan. He tells me he loves me no matter what. He said I told my wife about you and that I'm in love with you and I want a divorce. I told him to please don't do that and that it wasn't right to treat his wife that way. He said it wasn't my fault. They were drifting apart anyways. Then he said I'm picking up for dinner at 5:30 and I'm not taking no for an answer. I ignored the messages during the day and just went about my off day. At around 5:25, my video doorbell rings and he's standing on my porch for at least 15 minutes. I told him I wasn't home and that he should leave. He continues to text me and even begs to come pick me up from my parents. I was home the whole time, but I was just too scared to let him know that. I eventually called the non-emergency police station, but he had already left by the time I got through. I filed a general report, but technically they can't do anything unless he's standing on my porch threatening me. They advised me to make a report through LYFT, so I did. And I haven't heard anything since then, but honestly, that was one of the most threatening and creepy moments of my life. I've also attached the doorbell footage so you can get an idea of what he's like.
Come on, open up, please. Be sweet. Don't disappoint me, please. Cat? Come on, hon, please open up. I know you're in there.
I live next to Yellowstone National Park, which in itself has drawn millions of tourists each year. Part of the reason I'm writing this is merely a warning to people who decide to visit during the summer months. Last year in the summer of 2020, me and some of my buddies decided to go have a night out and do some camping out near a spot that we had been to multiple times in the past. After all, this was right after things started to become normal again and lockdowns were being lifted. I decided to head up to the camp spot early in an effort to make sure my gear was still set up from earlier that day. I did this as an effort to preserve the spot as it's first come first serve. Therefore, with everything in hand, I left my house right before sunset. We were all supposed to meet up within the hour, so I didn't really have any concerns of being by myself. I then began my 30-minute drive up to the location. When I finally arrived, I immediately noticed my tent and everything inside was gone. Now, just for some context, I staked the tent down in multiple areas just to be sure it stayed for the period I was gone. Inside was my sleeping bag and a few other miscellaneous items I left just to keep it weighed down. However, everything, literally everything, disappeared as if it was never there in the first place. I looked around and even the stakes and rocks I placed on the outside were missing. I immediately knew something was terribly wrong because I didn't see any campers on the way up. Also, keep in mind I don't have cell service as it's a couple miles back into the wilderness. I then decided to drive back down from where I came to get service and get a hold of my friends and let them know what happened. Needless to say, I wasn't happy with the situation and knew that whoever took my belongings were still in the area as it had only been there for an hour or two. However, my friends insisted that I stayed and at least hang out for a few hours as it took weeks of planning. So once I made sure everyone arrived, I then decided to go around the area in search of any sign of footprints or indications that maybe these people were close by. As you can guess, I wasn't able to find anything. I eventually played it off and decided that I would just look for it in the morning and contact the Forest Service to report it missing. I also didn't want to ruin the party for everyone and decided to stay. In hindsight, this was by far one of the worst decisions I could have ever made. As the night went on, everything seemed fine, so I thought. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, most of my friends decided to call it a night. I ended up sleeping in my truck. This was perhaps one of the better decisions I made this night. That, along with always making sure to bring my bear spray and sidearm for protection from unexpected guests. I eventually fell asleep. However, it's important to note that I was still a bit on edge as only a couple of hours before all my belongings were taken. I decided to leave my window rolled down a bit just in case I heard anything creep up on us in the middle of the night. After about 2 hours of me being asleep, my worst nightmare came true. At first, I just heard something moving around outside our camp. This was enough noise to wake me up, and I immediately froze and didn't move whatsoever. Therefore, this was partially because I knew whatever was making the noise was large, not just a raccoon or smaller creature. I then was paralyzed just listening intently to whatever was happening outside our camp. My first thought was that it was probably a bear. We also had sightings recently in the area, and at one point I swear it could have only been maybe 20 or 30 yards away. Also, another key point I noticed was there was absolutely no other noises. Usually there's grasshoppers or birds, but it was completely and utterly silent. Now, in a wilderness, that's never a good sign. It means there's a large predator or something of the like in the area. Meanwhile, it's pitch black outside and our fire had completely gone out. After about 15 minutes of not hearing anything, I decided I just needed to stop being paranoid. But just as I was about to fall back asleep, I saw something to the right of our campsite. It was just a few yards away from our fire pit and probably about 20 yards from me. To my absolute horror, it was a person. I immediately freaked. This was no average person either, let alone the fact that it's 3 or 4 in the morning and you're in someone's campsite. This person was wearing what I made out to be some kind of mask. I got a very good look at whoever it was, and it was a deer skull on their face. They were wearing a black robe, and that's about all I noticed. I didn't want to leave my truck and confront this person, so I did what I thought was best. I turned my truck on and began honking the horn until all my friends were awake. I rolled down the window and told them, "We need to get out of here immediately." After seeing what I saw, they did exactly that. Meanwhile, this person hasn't moved yet, mind you. And just as I thought it was bad, the situation started to get even worse. More of these figures began to appear in front of us through the trees, wearing the same outfits as mentioned earlier, but with multiple different masks. I immediately put my truck into reverse and began speeding away. They began walking closer and closer, but luckily I was able to drive out of that spot in time. As I began to speed down the road out of there, 3 more of these figures appeared out from the side of my truck, this time with a dog and way more aggressive than the previous ones I saw. They began throwing rocks at my truck and chasing after me. At one point, they were literally right next to my passenger window until I accelerated even more and eventually lost them. As I looked back in my mirror, I saw only one figure left, just simply peeking and staring at me behind a tree, and this image will forever be seared into my head. From this night on, I refused to ever go back up there. I've never, ever spoken of this to really anyone. Even when I was around my friends that experienced this, we just never really had the courage to talk about it. It was just so surreal. It's been over a year now since this happened, and well, all I can say is that I believe these people were in some sort of cult. I heard some other stories about similar events happening and even cattle completely disappearing in that area. It's very barbaric, and you wouldn't think that such a beautiful national park that attracts so many people year-round would have such dark and disturbing secrets. My advice to anyone that decides to travel to these mysterious and preserved parks of intrinsic beauty would be to always bring protection of some kind. Likewise, make sure you let others know about your plans and never go alone. There are hundreds of missing person reports across the national parks inside the United States, and I could have very well been one of them if I had stayed just a few minutes longer. Nature has a way to attract very different types of people. Some want to explore and push themselves to their limits. Meanwhile, some simply don't want to be seen and lurk in the darkness of night. A former Green Beret once told me that the key to survival was always being aware of your surroundings and listening to your gut. If a particular situation doesn't feel right, chances are it's not. Stay safe, everyone. When I was 19, I was a Marine and had stupidly used my military perks to get a home loan and bought my first house. I moved a barracks room worth of stuff into this place that seemed to me like a palace. Of course, I went out and bought some bar stools, a futon to sleep on until I got a bed, and some used coffee tables for my TV. I also had a dog with me. I was unpacking my meager belongings in the living room and noticed a car had pulled into my driveway and blocked me in. I walked out and there stood a man offering to sell me a home security system. The man was dressed in khakis and a polo with a name tag that I can't recall, and the car didn't have a logo on it. It should have been a red flag for me, but I figured that some people in the job didn't drive company vehicles. He gave me his card. I don't even remember the company he told me he was with, to be honest. Cue the friendly salesman, giving me his pitch about needing a system and all the perks that would come with being able to watch the exterior of my house at any time. As a low-ranking military member, I knew I couldn't afford yet another thing, so my mind was working to try to get this man to go away. I even considered ninja chopping him or whatever it is that we Marines do in hand-to-hand just to get him to leave. But I'm a sort of passive person. I suppose too nice. Nah, we'll call it polite. I won't be rude to someone doing their job. I've been in customer service, so I could relate. I tried politely declining his offer after he had tried to show me some stuff on his iPad, but you know how persistent the types can be. I'll admit to my own stupidity when answering his questions, like giving out too much information. Do you live here alone? No, I live here with my wife and our large 3 dogs. At least I added in the large part. Her and her dogs hadn't actually moved in yet, and hers were just fat, though they were more vicious than my own good boy. But 2 women living together probably seemed like easier targets. I also mentioned being a Marine when he asked. He had seemed a bit shocked, but wouldn't be deterred. What kind of security system do you have? My dogs and me. Not the best answer I could have given. I wasn't exactly intimidating. I mean, I would be terrifying if I had a gun or something. I've been using them my whole life, and I've never missed a target, alive or inanimate. If you would invite me in, I can show you the best places to set up cameras. He mentioned more than a few times. Each time made me more and more creeped out, thinking that he was wanting to potentially rob me, not that there was much to take. And despite being an assault victim, all I could consider was a possible burglary, and made sure that we stayed away from my house while we talked. We were outside for about 15 minutes total, me spending most of that time trying to politely get away from him and retreat inside. I wound up at my wit's end with social niceties and just walked away, leaving him standing alone in my front yard. I walked into my house and locked the door. He got into his car and left, and I thought nothing more of it. After some unpacking, I couldn't do much. I had nowhere to put most of it. I ate some junk food and put together the futon. I got it all decked out with my fluffiest blankets, made sure the doors and windows were locked, and went to lay down in the living room. Looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't put it in the bedroom. They all have blinds and the rooms take a bit of getting to. Perhaps I wanted to be near an exit. For some context, my back door is a double-glass pane door. At the time, I didn't have curtains on it, but I did have blinds in the kitchen window. My kitchen, living room, and dining room are all connected, but there's a wall in the living room that I strategically situated my futon against so it couldn't be seen by the back doors or the front door window. Call me paranoid, whatever. I had been laying down for a few hours, and at about 11, my dog got off the futon and went to the back door. My dog is large and looks like a Rottweiler in coloring. He's a coonhound mix, but I guess city people don't have hunting dogs. But he's never hurt anything in his life. He'll greet strangers at the door with a tail wag and hardly barks. He stood back there for a bit and whined a few times. I ignored him. It was probably just a squirrel. But then he started growling, a sound that I'll never forget. It sent terror straight through me as I sat alone in the dark. I had only ever felt that fear once when a mountain lion screamed and I realized that I was powerless against nature. But that's a story for a different thread. The point is, these sounds are designed to scare you, and it petrified me. I was frozen and wanted to wimp out, to hide, to call the cops. But I realized if someone was out there, they'd for sure see my phone light and know where I was. So while my dog stayed stationed at the back door, I talked myself up just enough to move off the couch and investigate, still scared out of my mind. I slunk to the kitchen and grabbed a kitchen knife, one of the only utensils I had, thanks Ma, and crept to the kitchen window. I was squatting amongst the cabinets so I couldn't be seen from any windows, bouncing a little, trying to gear up to peel back the blinds. My brain was telling me irrational things, horror stories that I had read come to life. To be real, I was ready to just cower and give up. I'm not a brave person. I was in communications, for God's sake. Pretty far from any life-threatening situation. Well, not one that involves people at my house. And my one safe space. My hideout. My protection from anything outside wanting in. I've always been afraid of home invasion. It stems from an incident when I was younger that isn't even really worth mentioning further. The point being, if someone dares enter my safe place, it's not safe anymore. I thought I couldn't get scared more in that moment, but then I saw a male figure in my backyard. and my heart dropped. It wasn't very far from the window I was looking out of. He was bold enough not to wear anything over his head, and I saw the blonde hair in the moonlight. It only took me a few seconds to recognize the security salesman in the dark. He was on the edge of my porch, watching my back door, watching my dog. I jumped up quickly, climbed over the bar counter, and turned on the lights as I went towards the back door to let my still growling dog out in hopes that he'd at least get rid of the man, if not injure him. No dice. As soon as the lights came on, he had just enough time to go jump the low part of the fence to safety before my dog even got off the porch. I didn't sleep that night. My dog sat on the futon with me, calm as could be, having done his job. The next morning I filed a police report, but I couldn't tell his name or what company he was with, having lost the card that he gave me. They sent some patrols through the area, and I found out that all legitimate salesmen should give an ID upon request. That night, I had 2 friends stay with me, ready for him to come back to either A, try to rob me or commit some more nefarious acts, or B, try to scare me into home security. He didn't come back, and I haven't seen him since. My dog hasn't growled like that since either, but I'm terrified for the next time that I hear it. When I was 12 years old, I got an unusual opportunity. I was able to be involved in a study abroad program where I would live in England for several months, from a very small town in the US originally. The program was run through my middle school, and I went over to England with a group of around 15 other 12-year-olds. Before we went to the homes we would be living in for the next few months, we ended up staying in London for about a week to do some sightseeing. When we got there, we were staying in a small hostel downtown, and my school had essentially rented out the entire hostel for the kids and for the adults that were chaperoning the trip. If I remember correctly, there were 2 adults with us. Every day we would have a scheduled activity, then we would have a significant amount of free time where we were allowed to explore the city as a group with just the kids and no adults. The second day we were there, my friends and I were out together, and we ended up stopping to look at some kiosks that had souvenirs. We were about a block from our hostel. I was around the back side of the kiosk. It would look like I was alone, and I feel someone grab my arm. I turn and see a middle-aged man, seemingly homeless, looking at me and says, "Hello there, pretty little girl," in the creepiest voice I'd ever heard. I immediately darted around the other side of the kiosk back to my friends. "Hello there, pretty little girl," in the creepiest voice I'd ever heard. I immediately darted around the other side of the kiosk back to my friends. Before I can even tell them what happened, he came around and got super close to me and said, "You can run, but you can't hide. I'll find you." And then he walked away. I immediately grabbed my friend and started pulling her back towards the direction of our hostel. I was crying when we got back there and told our chaperones what had happened. They essentially brushed it off and didn't do anything. Every day we were in London from then on, I would see him 1 to 3 times a day when we were out. He'd never get close and never say anything, but he would always be smiling while watching me. Every time I would see him, I would point him out to either one of the chaperones or another kid in our group. On the last day we were there, we were getting ready to leave, and we were catching a train from London to Leeds. While we were waiting at the train platform, I hear, "Bye, little girl. I'll see you soon." And I turn around, and sure enough, he's there. He quickly leaves, and again, no one in my group really does anything, except for the other kids. They were all equally freaked out. I never saw him again after seeing him on the train platform, but I still remember his voice. Every time I think of it, I get a shiver down my spine and think about how close I was to danger. I was in high school in the best shape of my life. I wasn't an athlete or anything, but I was growing into a woman's body, 5'8", tall, and a long, youthful body almost completely made of muscle. And for that short period of my life, I was actually interested in maintaining myself, so I started a morning routine of going for a walk before breakfast. I lived in a neighborhood adjacent to this great park where I spent my life growing up. Soccer, practice, dates, you name it. I believed that by hanging upside down on the monkey bars once a day before breakfast, that would stretch my spine just enough to keep growing taller and to alleviate any compression that might cause pain as I got older. On a hot summer morning before 10 a.m., I rolled out of bed, got dressed, and headed for the park. I don't think that it's necessary to describe the area beyond the fact that it was completely surrounded by houses. It was a pretty safe spot. The parking lot comes first between my street and the park itself. In the lot, I could see a white van. The park district has vehicles that look just like it for things like picking up litter, sanitizing the playground, and bringing out the mowing equipment. I thought this van was here to trim trees or something, so I paid it little attention and headed for those monkey bars. Before I could make it to the playground, a voice stopped me.
Hey,
A man called from the driver's seat. A second voice came from the passenger seat.
come over here.
I walked away, disinterested, but knowing that two men had rolled their windows down to watch me and talk to me made me feel self-conscious. I didn't want my shirt to roll up while I hung upside down or stretch my hamstrings and give them a show of any kind that would give them the satisfaction. These were grown-up men and I was in high school, and needless to say, I felt like prey and I knew it. Pretty creeped out, I decided to go for my routine walk, determined not to let two idiots change my workout. A woman has a right to go about her business. And that fear turned to anger as the white van with the windows rolled down and crept alongside me. I was on the sidewalk, so a safe enough distance from the van on the road. I can't remember what they were hollering at me, but you can bet that it was degrading and not at all what grown men should be saying to a minor. My anger boiled up inside, and before I let them get away with making me feel so violated, I decided to express myself too. I shot my middle finger high into the air and wagged it around. Now here's where the big oop happens. I know that this road darts into several no-outlet neighborhoods, and turning into one, especially if you're not around here like these guys were, means that you're going to U-turn and come back around, and that's exactly what they did. As soon as I saw the white van accelerate angrily and swoop into the adjoining street, I knew that they were about to come back for me. My stomach dropped and I knew that I had only seconds to hide. No, I wouldn't reach the park in time. I knew that by the time that I had reached it, they would spot wherever I was going and probably attack me. I was close to a turnoff into another neighborhood where I knew Mr. D had lived. Mr. D was a police officer and whose son happened to be dating my sister at the time, so I had his number. And I never ran so fast in my life. I dove behind a conifer tree in his front yard and made myself as small as possible in the shadows. Sure enough, that white van came from the opposite direction, inching down the road at only 5 miles an hour. The windows were rolled up this time, probably to make it easier to get away with stuffing a screaming girl into the back without anyone hearing. They stopped at the intersection where I disappeared. I took my phone out and texted Mr. D. "Hi, it's me. There are two guys following me and I'm hiding in a tree. Help." I watched through the pine needles as the guys pulled over and got out, talking quietly and looking around. I hated them, just watching as they talked about me. The front door swung open and Mr. D came out in full uniform. It turns out that I had texted him while he was leaving for work. He didn't look for me, but stamped down to the end of his driveway and looked down the street. Seeing those two men notice a cop staring at them and watching that white van speed away was a magnificent sight and clearly very telling of their intentions. Now, the second time that I was almost kidnapped on that curb happened that same summer, but this time it was raining lightly. It was dim and kind of muggy outside, so I remember that no one was outside except me. I started jogging regularly in the evening, and that day was no exception. I thought that the rain would keep me cool and enhance how much longer I could go, and indeed I was helped somewhat by the rain, for I had been running for a while and wasn't that tired yet. I kept my eyes focused on the sidewalk in front of me, but I could see the park slide past me in my peripheral vision. I was on the opposite side of the street, just like the last incident. A pretty beaten-up olive green sedan came rolling quietly up the road with its headlights off. I thought that was weird, but knew that it would soon pass me. The sedan was in the oncoming lane, so we were face to face for a few meters, and I noticed that it slowed down significantly before pulling over to the curb. I was running towards this parked car, which already rang my alarm bells. My suspicions flared into overdrive as the driver's side door opened, and a tall, bald man built like a refrigerator came out of it and crossed over to the passenger side. But I tell you, I amazed myself in that second. Before he'd even crossed in front of the first headlight, before my foot could finish another rhythmic step of a long jog, my brain sent a flaming hot shiver of adrenaline through my body so fast that I actually sprang up into the air when my foot landed and pushed me off the pavement. I spun around in midair and darted in a new direction away from the man. The phrase fight or flight ceased to be a figure of speech as I actually witnessed it transform my body and put my conscious self into autopilot. And if there's something I learned that day, it's that you can't choose fight or flight. Your body will do whichever it wants automatically. You might be programmed to be a fighter, or you might be someone like me, whose flight mode is so powerful that it thrusts you into space like a glitch in the Matrix. I didn't spring in the direction of the sidewalk. No, that was too dangerous. He would just follow me in his car. I actually saw houses whirring past me as I made my way through backyards and patios. And I wish I could say I never ran so fast in my life, but as you recall, I had already run for my life once before, and about that fast. I dared to look over my shoulder and I could see a dark blur of a large human maneuvering unnaturally through backyards directly on my tail. I don't know how, but I was able to outrun him. I think it was my knowledge of the neighborhood, having lived there all my life and knowing which houses had a fence, which ones would lead to more cover, and which ones would lead to dead ends. I burst into my house and blabbered the whole story out to anyone who would listen. To be blunt, no one really seemed to care. It's not like I had evidence of this happening, and because there was room for the possibility that I misinterpreted his stopping and getting out to maybe ask for directions or check on a tire, that's exactly what my family chose to believe. And for a long time I felt angry. Angry that these men came to my turf, my home, my neighborhood, and made me fearful. I couldn't think of any worse way to violate someone even if I wanted to, but men like that do it in their free time. I stopped working out after my second close encounter with abduction. I guess I look fine as a 23-year-old shut-in, but that's mainly thanks to my strict diet, and unfortunately, I don't know when I'll be able to feel comfortable working out again, as those dark associations that I have with those men and going out on a jog, it just creates this underlying sense of anxiety anytime I think about doing it. This is an example of one of my sister's ex-boyfriends who couldn't get over being dumped. It got to the point that we had to file a restraining order for 5 years. I really have no clue how it all works. But my father had a second line of work back in the days of dial-up internet. We hooked up a phone for it, and it was usually mixed up with Kmart's service desk number by 1 digit. My sister treated it like her private phone, and that annoyed my father and I since we used it for its intended purpose, online work. I used it to download music at the time with Napster, mostly Japanese rock music since no place had it in town. I was also learning Japanese and research for classes. One night while I did homework in the office, my sister asked if the phone rang at any point since I was offline. I told her no, but of course within an hour the phone was ringing. I answered to a guy demanding to talk to my sister. I sighed and went to get her. She asked me to leave the office and close the door. I don't know what happened exactly, but my sister went to get my father and the phone was disconnected, and then had an old-fashioned answering machine attached to a tape recorder that was the next call when connected. This went on for about 2 weeks. Her ex would call, leave some tirade, and then hang up. Call again, leave another tirade. Another night, I lost my cool and wanted to get online. Each time I tried, her ex would clog the line up, preventing a connection. Then one time I was online and he got the busy signal. He showed up at our house banging on the door, demanding that we let him in. I was home alone one day and saw him through a window. He didn't see me though. He got no answers as I refused to get off the computer. I also had the other phone, a wireless handheld, with me calling my dad, who called the police. When the cops came and took my sister's ex away, he was freaking out and had no car. So we had no idea how he was calling us since cell phones in the 1990s were expensive, and who he was staying with since his mom threw him out. He was also registered as a runaway by his dad, apparently. He also attempted to get in the house using the back door and garage, and each had at the time alarms set. When he couldn't get in through the front door, he tried other ways, which was weird considering that it was broad daylight. No neighbor called the police other than my father. Days later, we got the restraining order, which of course her ex violated by calling us non-stop, thinking we only had the voice message machine connected to one phone and didn't think to realize that we had two of them. He was sent to a mental health facility after that. I suppose some guys just don't take rejection well at all. During the beginning of my freshman year, one of my teachers was having some health problems, so we had subs most days. This happened a few months after she came back. One day, my dad was in the grocery store and I was waiting outside for him. I was sitting on a bench when one of the substitutes we had came up to me. There was a gym across the street and he looked like he had just come from it, as he was wearing workout clothes and was holding a large duffel bag. He knew my name and started talking to me about school. Me, being young and naive, just thought that he was being friendly and didn't realize anything was off. After a while, he sat down on the bench and got really close to me. We had been talking about a book that I was reading for school, and then he started telling me that he had a signed copy of it in his car and that he would really like to show it to me. I know I'm stupid, but at that point, I still really didn't think anything was off. He kept on mentioning his car and that he needed to drop his bag off, but he'd really like to continue the conversation and asked if I could walk with him. About 20 minutes into the conversation, which I know, should have been a red flag. What teacher talks to a student in public for that long? My dad finally came out and freaked out when he saw a random middle-aged man talking to his teenage daughter. When the substitute saw my dad, he introduced himself as my teacher, but then left really quickly. Somehow at that point, I still didn't feel off until a week later when I was reading the book that we had been talking about and something finally clicked in my head. I started freaking out. He was huge, well over 6 foot tall, and he could have easily overpowered me if he got me into his car. Plus, we were mostly by ourselves in the parking lot. Also, he could have had anything in that duffel bag. I think the final thing that confirmed his intentions was when a few weeks later, I had stayed after school to talk to a teacher and was taking a shortcut through one of the campus buildings. I was the only one in the hallway and looked into one of the classrooms and saw him. We made eye contact and he yelled my name. I started running down the hallway as fast as I could, and he started screaming at me to wait. He needed to talk to me. I didn't stop running until I was a few blocks away from the school. After that, he kind of disappeared. I never really saw him again. I really wanted to report him, but I actually had no idea what his name was. None of my friends did. I feel especially bad about this because what if he's done this to others since then? I guess one silver lining of online school is, as a substitute, he's probably out of a job, and the lockdown would make it much harder for him to predatorize children. I've been hesitant on posting any story mainly due to the fact that I don't want anyone ever thinking that I or the person the story is about is crazy. Although saying this actually happened sounds very cliche, I can assure you the following stories are true. Now, before I begin the first story, just a bit of background. I'm an intern for a church that does work at a Navajo reservation site helping the community on people's homes like roofing, repair, repainting, and interior fixing. 8 to 5 with good pay and nice people, so overall I'm happy with this. And as a bit of a disclaimer, I'm not trying to offend Navajo tradition in any way. This is just a first-hand story on what is currently happening on my trip. Over the past 2 months of the internship, I've begun to grow fairly close with some of the residents on the reservation. Like one lady in particular I got to know pretty well was the superstitious type. Like, she said that to never be outside at night or other random seeming things to me like that, but the biggest taboo I knew to never mention, mainly because I was told by my superiors, was Navajo folklore, like skinwalkers. However, one day it was very different in the sense that the question was just burning within me. I was on my lunch break after wrapping up painting parts of her house, and she sits next to me on her porch and we talk for a while, but I finally feel comfortable enough to ask her about any folklore about werewolves or anything of that sort. I didn't really expect a response. I thought maybe she'd quickly say no, then change the subject. But if anything, I was more scared I may have offended her. But to my surprise, she turns her head, looking towards the outside scenery, hesitates, but then says, "Yes, I know some, and I've experienced it too." She then proceeds to tell me a description of the apparent equivalent to a werewolf. To paraphrase, she said, "Werewolves look like normal people, but masked in white paint, covering their face, arms, and chest. Their whole body as white as a corpse, covered with black symbols quite possibly related to devil worshipping. More specifically, they are gravediggers and necromancers as well. They dig bodies up to steal jewelry, although they may perform other acts to corpses," as she quickly strayed away from going into too much detail about that point. "Werewolves also get their power from the devil. This is how they're able to possess such supernatural strength and endurance." I was surprised to hear this, although I figured werewolves wouldn't look anything like that in Twilight or Scooby-Doo. Although, deep down, even I thought she sounded a bit nuts. Before I could ask any more questions about these werewolves, she began to tell me her own interaction with these supernatural beasts, and her story still gives me chills. She explained that one day, her and her husband were driving on the curvy roads alongside the mountains, only to find a woman with her face covered by her hands and was kneeling in the middle of the road, appearing as though she was crying. The woman looks up towards the car's headlights to reveal the very same white paint and sacrificial symbols mentioned previously. Her husband honked his horn and quickly slams on the brakes, only to be too late, and hears the loud cracking sound of the woman's bones and the splash of blood all over the windshield. Once her and her husband stop the car safely and process what in God's name just happened, they quickly run over to the spot where they hit the woman. However, once they reached the spot, there was no body, but not only that, there was no trace of blood either. And just as a side note, this part of the reservation had some cliffs, but it was relatively flat land, so it would be obvious to tell where someone is, especially if they just got hit by a car. Puzzled by what the possible explanation could be for this occurrence, her and her husband drove back home, trying to neglect the thought that they just witnessed a werewolf. However, being the non-paranormal believers they were at the time, they tried to just close this occurrence off as them just losing their minds. And as interesting as her story was, this got me thinking, is it possible for this werewolf story to be true? Or is this her own way of describing a skinwalker or other supernatural phenomenon because she didn't think I knew what a skinwalker was? This question kept circulating through my head, so as you would expect, the following nights made it harder for me to sleep comfortably, and because of that, during the workdays I would feel more and more mentally drained and almost paranoid. At the end of the week at around 6, I was sitting in the car driving back to the church site and was in the mental state of mind where I was half awake and half asleep. My buddy was driving and claimed that he wanted to pull over to the gas station that was near the church to grab a couple of snacks to munch on during our debrief time in our cabin. Since I was too tired to argue, I said fine and laid my face against the window and tried to doze off while waiting for him. However, I had the weirdest feeling that I was being watched, so naturally I opened my eyes and looked out the window, but I saw nothing. However, when I turned my head out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a white figure, just as the woman described previously. I looked back and nothing was there, but I swear I saw something. Since it was beginning to get darker outside, I quickly sat up in my seat to readjust my vision, but when I looked back out the window, it was almost as though the figure vanished. Perplexed, I stepped outside the car and looked around, but there was no trace of a creature even existing. My buddy comes back to the car and questions me, what in God's name am I doing? Debating whether or not I should tell him, I decided to just say, "Oh, I'm just getting some fresh air. Let's head out." The following days have been even worse for me. My mood is getting worse. I'm feeling way more paranoid that something's out there, and at night I can almost swear that I hear screams in the distance. Everything outside just looks 100 times scarier too, because there is barely any outside light besides the moonlight, so everything has more of an exaggerated appearance. But believe me, I know I sound crazy. But the worst part is that if I tell anyone, they'll think I'm crazy too. So I've been debating whether or not I actually saw a werewolf the lady described, or if it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I hope someone can find some sort of answer to this werewolf mystery, or if you have any similar paranormal stories like these, please do share. I'm trying my best to become more aware about the paranormal. If I find anything, then I will give future updates about any more encounters or odd discoveries. Until then, I suppose I'll be lacking on sleep. To start, I'm a 21-year-old female, about 5'2", have a few tattoos, and I work in a medical office. Our office closes at 5 p.m., and usually I lock up the door after the last patient leaves around 4:55 p.m. I was extra busy yesterday and ended up forgetting to lock the door when I stayed a bit late. A tall man walks in, early 60s, scruffy beard, about 5'10", and reeks of alcohol. He immediately walks up to me and says, "I need a ride home. I don't have a car. Can you call me an Uber? I'll pay for it." And then he slides me his debit card. I thought, what the heck? Sure, good karma for the day. I open up the app on my phone and asked him for the address. He tells me, and I let him know that it'll be about $20. I order it and tell them that they'll arrive in about 15 minutes. He says thanks and heads out the door to sit in the rocking chairs on the front stoop. I locked the door behind him and started cleaning the patient rooms for the next day. After I was finally done, I grabbed my things and clocked out. I always leave through the back door because it's the closest to the parking lot. I open the door and take one step out, and there he is, standing outside, seemingly waiting for me. He blurts out before I can say anything, "Hey, how far are they now?" I unlock my phone and tell them they're about 9 minutes away. "Okay, ma'am," he says, and I walk back into the office. I call out for the doctor. He's a larger man at 6'4" and must work out at least 4 or 5 times a week. I felt safer asking him to walk me to my car. He, of course, says yes. The doc walked me to my car, and that was that. After I got home, I checked the status of the ride, and it said, "Canceled." The guy was charged $18.50 for not being able to be picked up at the location. Weird, I thought. Oh well, I did my part, and went to bed without it entering my mind again. The real issue came the next day. I come into work at 7:45 a.m., and I'm usually the first to arrive. I let myself in, turn off the alarm, and get ready for the day. Everything is normal for a while. 8:30 rolls around and he walks in, the same guy from the day before. He's well dressed this time, and I can see car keys in his hands. I quickly duck behind the counter and rush to tell the doctor about the weird guy being back. The doctor practically scrambles out of his office and sprints to the lobby. He asks the man if he needed help with anything, and the man says, No, I'm not a patient. I just want to talk to the nice girl with the tattoos." The doctor replied, "No, if you're not a patient, then we can't help you. Please leave." The man scoffs and storms out. He gets into his vehicle and sits in the parking lot right in front of the main entry door. About 5 minutes later, I go back up front and realize he's still there. By now, the doctor's angry and fed up. He calls the cops and the police trespass him from the property. No charges were pressed. He didn't technically do anything wrong. He may have been completely harmless, but overall it just seems sketchy that he had a car after all. I also looked at the address he gave me, and it's the address for Walmart. My work is now implementing the buddy system, which I would recommend all workplaces do. No one leaves alone, and we stick in groups. You never know what people may want to do to you. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.